London, 1819. The candlelit ballroom of Ashford House blazed with hundreds of beeswax tapers, their warm glow casting dancing shadows across the marble floors where London's finest moved in elegant formation. Silk rustled against silk as ladies in jewel-toned gowns swept past gentlemen in black evening coats, the scene a portrait of wealth and privilege perfected over generations. Yet, at the servants' entrance behind the musicians' gallery, pressed against the cold stone archway where no guest should ever stand, Cora remained utterly still. At 22, she had learned the art of invisibility, though not in the way these glittering creatures practiced it. Where they disappeared into the anonymity of privilege, she vanished into the architecture itself, another shadow among the drapery. Her dress, stolen from a washing line that very afternoon, was 2 seasons out of fashion and hung badly on her undernourished frame. But it was silk, and from a distance, in this light, it might pass. It had to pass. The memory rose unbidden, as it always did when she was cold and desperate. 3 years ago, almost to the day, the drawing room of the house that had once been her home, winter sunlight streaming through windows she would never see again. Her father's voice, carefully neutral. "It's for the best, Cora. Your stepmother and I have discussed it at length." And her stepmother, standing beside the fireplace in a gown the color of dried blood, her smile sharp enough to draw blood of its own. "You understand, don't you, dear? We simply cannot afford to maintain you. Not with your father's debts. It's only practical." Practical. As though casting your daughter into the streets were no different than dismissing an unnecessary chambermaid. She had begged. God help her, she had begged. And her father had looked away, his jaw tight, while her stepmother's cold satisfaction filled the room like poison gas. "You don't belong here." Cora's head snapped toward the voice, the memory shattering. A footman, young, perhaps 16, stood 3 feet away, his livery immaculate, his expression torn between duty and something that might have been pity. "I'm waiting for someone," Cora lied, her voice low but steady. She had learned long ago that confidence, even false confidence, could buy precious seconds. "No, you're not." The footman glanced toward the ballroom, then back. "I saw you slip past the gate. I should call for, please." The word escaped before Cora could stop it, and she hated the sound of her own desperation. "Just give me 10 minutes. There's food on the refreshment table. I only need—" She stopped. Even to her own ears, it sounded pathetic. The footman's face softened, then hardened again. "I have a position to keep. If the butler finds you, I'll be dismissed." "I understand," Cora said quietly, and she did. She understood that survival was a calculation everyone made, and that she had nothing to offer that outweighed his risk. Through the archway, she caught a glimpse of a gentleman near the card room, older, distinguished, his graying hair pomaded back from a face she recognized even after 3 years. Her father. Nathaniel Hartley stood laughing with a group of younger men, a crystal glass in his hand, his evening coat cut to hide the slight paunch he'd developed. At 50, he still carried himself with the ease of a man who had never been denied. And beside him, her hand possessively on his arm, stood the woman who had orchestrated Cora's destruction. Cora's chest tightened. She should leave, slip back out before anyone else noticed, before she was dragged before them like a criminal, before her stepmother's cold satisfaction and her father's averted gaze could finish what they had started 3 years ago. But where would she go? Back to the doorway off Chandler Street? Back to the fever-ridden boarding house where 2 women had died last week? "You should go now," the footman said, not unkindly. "Before there's trouble." The orchestra faltered, then stopped entirely. A hush fell across the ballroom like a curtain dropping, sudden and complete. Every head turned toward the main entrance. His Grace, the Duke of Thorncroft. The butler's voice rang out, formal and reverent. Cora's breath caught. Julian Vance, 6th Duke of Thorncroft, stood in the doorway as though he had been carved from the same marble as the columns behind him. At 35, he was not handsome in the soft way of drawing-room favorites. His features were too severe, his jaw too sharp, his mouth too uncompromising. But he commanded the space around him with the gravitational pull of old power and older money. His dark hair was unfashionably longer than the current mode, brushing his collar. His eyes, a pale, unsettling gray, swept the room without warmth. The air itself seemed to reorganize around him. "Good God," breathed a woman nearby, her voice carrying in the silence. "I didn't think he'd actually come." "Lady Eleanor will be beside herself," her companion whispered. "She's been preparing for this moment all season. A duke like Thorncroft doesn't choose lightly. This is practically a declaration." Cora watched as the duke moved forward, acknowledging no one directly. He accepted greetings with the barest inclination of his head, his expression unchanged, as though the entire glittering assembly were beneath his notice, or behind glass he could not, or would not, break. "Miss," the footman began urgently. But Cora had seen it. Her father, emboldened by wine and desperation, and she recognized even from across the room, had begun to make his unsteady way toward the Duke. No, she didn't think. She moved. Cora stepped out of the shadows and directly into her father's path, her hand catching his sleeve. "Father," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't." Nathaniel Hartley's eyes widened in shock, then horror, then a fury so cold it froze her blood. "How dare you?" he hissed, wrenching his arm away. "How dare you show your face, Mr. Hartley?" The voice was quiet, but it cut through the rising murmur of the ballroom like a blade. Cora looked up and found herself staring directly into the glacial gray eyes of the Duke of Thorncroft. "Your Grace," her father stammered, his face flushing. She is no one. A disturbance. I'll have her removed immediately." The Duke's gaze shifted from her father to Cora. For one long, impossible moment, those pale eyes held hers. She saw no warmth there, no recognition, no emotion she could name. Only a cold calculation, as though she were a puzzle he was solving in real time. Then Julian Vance, Duke of Thorncroft, did the impossible. He extended his hand to her. "Forgive my tardiness," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom. The traffic from Thorncroft was abominable. Cora stared at his outstretched hand as though it were a serpent. "Your Grace," her father tried again, his voice rising with panic. "I assure you this woman is not—" "She is with me," the Duke said, his tone allowing no argument. His eyes never left Cora's face. "She is to be my Duchess." The ballroom erupted. "My beautiful family, before we continue with Cora's desperate gamble at the Duke's ball, I need to ask you something. If you've ever felt invisible, discarded, or felt like you didn't belong, this story was written for you. But here's the thing. YouTube's algorithm only shows stories like this to people who actually engage. So if you want to see more tales of broken people finding unconditional love, of survivors refusing to stay victims, of second chances that feel earned, hit that subscribe button right now, because if you don't, You're telling YouTube you don't care about these stories. And honestly, Cora fought too hard for her happy ending for us to let her story disappear into the void. Subscribe. Let's prove survival stories matter. The Duke's study at Ashford House, borrowed for the evening from his host, smelled of leather, tobacco, and old money. Cora stood in the center of the Persian carpet, still trembling from the explosion of scandal they had left behind in the ballroom. Her stolen dress felt suddenly transparent, as though the Duke's pale eyes could see through silk to the bruises beneath. The hunger. The 3 years of calculated survival. Julian Vance closed the door with a precision that somehow felt more final than a slam. He moved to the sideboard without a word, poured 2 glasses of brandy, and extended one toward her. Cora didn't take it. "Why did you do that? You looked as though you needed rescuing." He set the glass on the desk between them. "Was I mistaken? You don't rescue beggars in ballrooms unless you need something from them." Cora forced herself to meet his gaze, though everything in her wanted to look away from that unnerving, colorless stare. "What do you want?" Something that might have been approval flickered across his features. Directness. "Good. We'll save considerable time." He moved to the desk, bracing his hands against the mahogany surface. Even in stillness, he seemed coiled, controlled. "I require a wife, immediately. You require protection. I propose an exchange." Cora's laugh was brittle. "You're a duke. You could have any woman in London." Precisely the problem. Julian's voice remained level, as though discussing livestock breeding. "I am expected to marry Lady Eleanor Ashcroft. The banns are prepared. The settlements drafted. Her father controls 3 seats in Parliament by need for the Enclosure Act reform. The marriage has been arranged since we were children. Then marry her. I would sooner set Thorncroft Abbey alight." For the first time, real emotion darkened his tone. "Lady Eleanor is brilliant, ruthless, and has spent the last year systematically positioning herself to control not just my title, but my estates, my investments, my independence. She has her father's talent for manipulation and none of his restraint." Cora studied him, her street-sharpened instincts cataloging every detail. The tension in his shoulders. The careful control of his expression. The slight whiteness of his knuckles against the desk. "You're afraid of her." "I am cautious." He straightened, reaching for his own brandy. "Lady Eleanor views marriage as a hostile acquisition. I view it as a necessity I have delayed too long. Tonight was to be her triumph, my public capitulation before all of London. Instead, I have claimed a bride of my own choosing." "Except you didn't choose me. You don't even know my name." "Cora Hartley." Julian's eyes narrowed slightly. "Daughter of Nathaniel Hartley, gentleman of rapidly diminishing fortune. Disappeared from society 3 years ago under circumstances your father seems desperate to obscure. Currently residing, I suspect, somewhere considerably less comfortable than your father's house." The accuracy of it struck like a fist to the stomach. "You had me investigated between the ballroom and this study?" "I had your father investigated last year when he approached me for a loan." "You were mentioned in the report?" He paused. The investigator noted it was unusual for a man to so thoroughly erase a daughter from his household accounts. Cora's throat tightened. "He didn't erase me. He threw me out." "Then we have something in common." Julian's voice remained flat, but his fingers tightened around the crystal glass. "My father spent his final years attempting to destroy everything I valued. Control dressed as concern, affection wielded like a weapon. I learned early that family can be the most dangerous threat of all." She wanted to ask more, but his expression had closed again, shuttered like a house before winter. "Here is what I offer," Julian continued, his tone returning to that cold calculation. "You will become the Duchess of Thorncroft, immediately, special, license, private ceremony. Fait accompli before Lady Eleanor can marshal her forces. You will live at the Abbey, provided with everything you require. Security, protection, a position no one, not your father, not your stepmother, can strip away. And what do you require from me? Discretion, cooperation, and most importantly, presence." He set down the glass with careful precision. "You will accompany me to necessary social functions. You will manage the household when required. You will be seen as the Duchess I have chosen, which will be sufficient to end Lady Eleanor's expectations and her father's political leverage." "You want a shield," Cora said slowly. "A human barrier between you and her." "I want a marriage of mutual convenience that preserves both our freedoms." Julian's gray eyes held hers. "I will not require the usual expectations. Your chambers will be your own. Your time, your own. I ask only that you maintain the appearance of the role when necessary." It was everything she needed. Safety, a roof, a name that would protect her from the streets, from her father's cruelty, from the grinding desperation of survival. And it was nothing she could trust. "You don't know me," Cora said carefully. "I could be a criminal, a confidence artist. I could steal your silver and disappear." "You could try." His mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile. "I suspect you're considerably more practical than that. And I know precisely what you are. A woman your family discarded, who has survived 3 years through intelligence and resourcefulness. Those are qualities I value far more than bloodlines and dowries." "This isn't a fairy tale, Your Grace." "I am aware." Julian moved around the desk, stopping precisely 3 feet from her, close enough to speak privately, far enough to preserve the careful distance he seemed to require. "I am offering you a transaction. Protection for performance, security for discretion. If you prefer the streets to Thorncroft Abbey, the door remains open." Cora looked at him, this cold, controlled man who spoke of marriage as though negotiating a business contract, who needed her presence to shield him from a woman he feared more than poverty, more than scandal. Who was offering her the one thing she had lost 3 years ago? A place where she could not be thrown out on a whim. "I accept," she said quietly. Julian nodded once, as though she had confirmed an expected calculation. "We leave for Gretna Green at dawn." The journey north had taken 4 days, conducted in a silence so complete it felt like a third passenger in the carriage. Julian worked through correspondence with methodical precision, his pen scratching against paper, while Cora watched the landscape transform from London's smoke-stained brick to rolling countryside she barely remembered from childhood. She had married him in Gretna Green with 2 strangers as witnesses. The ceremony lasted 7 minutes. Julian had signed the register with the same expression he might use reviewing accounts. She had signed Cora Vance, Duchess of Thorncroft, and felt like a forger. Now, as the carriage rounded a final curve and Thorncroft Abbey rose before them, Cora understood exactly how vast the chasm was between the beggar she had been yesterday and the Duchess she was supposed to become. The Abbey sprawled across the hillside like a sleeping giant, all pale stone and Gothic windows, its towers catching the late afternoon sun. Formal gardens stretched in geometric precision toward distant woods. Even the air smelled different here, clean, empty of smoke and desperation and other people's suffering. "It's old," Julian said. his first voluntary words in hours. Parts date to the 14th century. The East Wing was added by my grandfather. It requires constant attention, constant funding, constant vigilance. You love it, Cora said. Surprised by the barely perceptible softening in his voice, his expression shuddered immediately. I maintain it. There's a difference. The carriage halted before the main entrance. Footmen materialized in perfectly synchronized formation. The door opened. Steps descended. And Cora found herself facing a wall of servants assembled with military precision. At their head stood a woman whose steel-gray dress matched the iron in her spine. She curtsied with exactly the depth protocol required for a duchess. No more, no less. But her eyes performed a swift, devastating assessment that left Cora feeling transparent. Mrs. Pemberton, Julian said, descending from the carriage. May I present my wife, Her Grace, the Duchess of Thorncroft. The silence that followed felt like judgment solidified into air. Cora stepped down, acutely aware of how her borrowed traveling dress, purchased in haste somewhere between London and Scotland, hung on her frame. How her hands, chapped from 3 years of survival, looked against the fine fabric. How every eye catalogued her deficiencies with the precision of an accounting ledger. Your Grace. Mrs. Pemberton's curtsy to Cora was identical to the first, correct, cold, revealing nothing. Welcome to Thorncroft Abbey. We have prepared the Duchess's apartments in the East Wing. Thank you. Cora's voice sounded strange to her own ears, too rough for these marble halls and painted ceilings. I'm sure they'll be suitable. Something flickered across Mrs. Pemberton's face. Disapproval, perhaps. Or pity, which would be worse. Mrs. Pemberton will show you to your rooms, Julian said, already turning toward another wing, toward escape. We dine at 8. I've arranged for appropriate attire to be delivered. He left without looking back. The Duchess's apartments occupied an entire corner of the East Wing. A suite of rooms so vast, Cora could have housed a dozen families from Chandler Street within them. The bedroom alone dwarfed her father's entire drawing room. Silk wallpaper in shades of cream and gold. Furniture that looked older than the Abbey itself. Windows overlooking gardens that seemed to extend to the horizon. A prison cell with expensive upholstery. The wardrobe has been prepared with a preliminary selection, Mrs. Pemberton said, opening doors to reveal gowns in colors Cora had forgotten existed. His Grace's instructions were quite specific regarding your measurements and coloring. The modiste will attend tomorrow for proper fittings. How did he know my measurements? His Grace is observant. Mrs. Pemberton's tone suggested this was explanation enough. Your lady's maid, Susan, will assist you. Dinner is formal. The household staff will be presented beforehand in the drawing room at 7:30. Cora turned from the window. Mrs. Pemberton, I should tell you that you are unaccustomed to running a ducal household? The housekeeper's expression remained neutral, but something sharp glinted in her eyes. That you have not been trained in the management of a staff of 73? That the previous Duchess's standards were exacting and her shadow looms large? The directness was almost refreshing. Yes, Cora said quietly. All of that. Then you should also know that gossip travels faster than His Grace's carriage. Mrs. Pemberton moved toward the door, her keys chiming at her waist. The staff is aware you are not Lady Eleanor. They are aware the marriage was sudden. They are waiting to see whether you will comport yourself as their mistress or as an interloper who will disappear when His Grace tires of whatever impulse prompted this union. Cora's hands tightened on the windowsill. And what do you believe? I believe His grace does nothing on impulse, Mrs. Pemberton said. Which means you serve a purpose. Whether you can rise to it remains to be seen. Susan will attend you at 7 o'clock. The door closed with a soft click that sounded remarkably like a cell locking. Cora lasted until the footsteps faded, then sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unreliable. The room spun slightly, too large, too ornate, too thoroughly wrong. She caught her reflection in the mirror across the room. A thin woman in a traveling dress, her face still carrying the sharp angles of hunger. Her eyes those of someone accustomed to checking exits. Not a duchess. Not even close. A knock at the connecting door made her start. Julian entered without waiting for permission, still in his traveling clothes, a leather portfolio under one arm. "I've prepared a schedule," he said, moving to the writing desk and extracting several pages covered in his precise script. "Mrs. Pemberton will instruct you on household management. The vicar's wife will cover social protocols. You'll take meals with the senior staff until you're comfortable with the necessary etiquette. I've also arranged—" "You're confining me," Cora interrupted. Julian's pen stilled. "I'm educating you. You're keeping me locked in this wing like a mad relation until I've been properly trained." She stood, the street fighter in her rising despite the silk surroundings. "What happens if I fail your lessons? Do I get returned like defective merchandise?" "You won't fail." He set down the pen with that careful precision that meant his control was costing him. "You survived 3 years alone. You can certainly survive a few weeks of instruction." Surviving and performing are different things. Then, learn to perform. His gray eyes met hers, cold and unyielding. "You agreed to this arrangement. I require a duchess who can function in society, not a charity case who hides in her apartments. The lessons begin tomorrow at 9. He left before she could respond, the door closing behind him with the same finality as Mrs. Pemberton's departure. Cora stood alone in her golden cage, surrounded by silk and silver and everything she had once thought she wanted, and felt more trapped than she ever had sleeping in doorways. At least on the streets, she had known the rules. The lessons were suffocating. For 2 weeks, Cora endured Mrs. Pemberton's tutorials on household management, memorizing which china service accompanied which course, how to address a viscount versus a baron, the precise angle at which a duchess should incline her head. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Aldrich, drilled her on conversations suitable for drawing rooms, bloodless observations about weather and watercolors that revealed nothing and meant less. Julian appeared only at dinner, a nightly performance where Cora demonstrated her progress like a trained animal. He would nod at her improved posture, her properly chosen wine, her appropriate responses to his carefully neutral questions. Then he would retreat to his study, and she would return to her apartments, the golden cage closing around her once more. On the 15th night, Cora stopped sleeping. Old habits, perhaps. On the streets, sleep had been a calculated risk, never fully surrendered to. Now, in her oversized bed with its silk hangings, she found herself listening to the Abbey's nocturnal sounds, the settling of ancient timbers, the wind against Gothic windows, the distant chime of the clock tower marking hours that stretched like years. At 2:30, she gave up the pretense entirely. The corridor outside her apartments was dark, the servants long retired. Cora moved through it as she had once moved through London's alleys, silent, careful, leaving no trace. She had learned the Abbey's rhythms these past weeks, the patterns of the staff, the areas they avoided. Old houses had overlooked spaces forgotten corners, places where someone could disappear. The servant's staircase descended into deeper darkness. Cora navigated by touch and memory, her feet finding the worn centers of stone steps. Below, she could hear voices, low, urgent, coming from what Mrs. Pemberton had identified as the butler's pantry. "Third time this month," a man was saying, his accent marking him as local. "Mr. Garrett's getting bold, asking for the silver plate now. He'll have us all dismissed." A woman's voice, tight with fear. "What choice do we have? He's the estate steward. He controls the wages, the references. Cross him, and we're out without a character." Cora pressed herself against the wall, listening. "My sister needs the apothecary," another voice added, younger, desperate. "Garrett said he'd advance me the money, but only if I cooperate. Said it'd be our secret." "Bastard," the first man spat, "bleeding the estate dry and threatening us with ruin if we tell his grace. Who'd believe servants over a steward with 20 years' service?" Cora's mind worked rapidly, cataloging information with the instincts honed in streets where survival meant reading situations faster than the law could run. A corrupt steward. Systematic theft disguised in account books. Staff coerced into cooperation through financial desperation and fear of dismissal. She had seen this pattern before in a different context. The crooked landlord on Chandler Street, who had operated identically until someone had thought to check his ledgers against actual inventory. The voices faded. Footsteps retreated deeper into the servants' quarters. Cora remained motionless, thinking. Then she climbed back upstairs, slipped into her apartments, and waited for morning. Julian was at breakfast when she found him, working through correspondence with his usual methodical focus. He looked up as she entered, surprise flickering across his features. She had never joined him for breakfast before. "I need to see the estate account books," Cora said without preamble. His pen stilled. "I beg your pardon?" "Your steward is stealing from you. I need the books to prove it." Julian set down the pen with careful precision. "That's a serious accusation. Mr. Garrett has managed Thorncroft's accounts for 2 decades. Then he's had 20 years to perfect the method." Cora moved to the sideboard, poured coffee she didn't want, used the motion to organize her thoughts. He's skimming supplies, inflating costs, demanding kickbacks from vendors. The household staff knows, but they're too terrified to tell you because he controls their wages and references. How could you possibly know this? I listened. She turned to face him. Something you seem to have forgotten people do in houses this size. Your servants talk, Your Grace. And last night, I heard them. Julian's expression had shifted from surprise to something more complex, calculation perhaps, or reassessment. "You were wandering the Abbey at night?" "I couldn't sleep in that mausoleum you call a bedroom." "But that's not the point." Cora set down the untouched coffee. "Your steward is corrupt. Your staff is being extorted. And your estate is hemorrhaging money while you sit here reviewing correspondence and ignoring what's happening in your own house." The silence stretched between them, cold and evaluating. "The account? Books," Julian said finally, standing. "Very well. But if you're wrong, we'll discuss boundaries regarding household management you haven't been trained to understand. And if I'm right?" His pale eyes held hers. "Then I will be remarkably interested in how you learn to spot financial fraud." The estate office occupied the ground floor of the West Wing, a realm of leather and ledgers that smelled of ink and old paper. Julian retrieved 3 massive volumes from the locked cabinet, spreading them across the desk. 5 years of accounts, he said. If there's systematic theft, it should appear as pattern. Cora pulled the nearest ledger toward her, running her finger down columns of expenditures. Her reading had always been adequate. Her mother had insisted on education before she died. But these weren't literature. These were numbers, quantities, the language of commerce, the language of survival. "Here," she said, after 20 minutes, tapping an entry. "Coal delivery March, listed as 8 tons at premium winter pricing. That's standard, except it's March. Winter's ending, prices drop." She flipped forward. June. Another 8 tons, same premium price. No household burns that much coal in summer, and certainly not at winter rates. Julian leaned over her shoulder, his attention sharpening. "Continue. Candles, beeswax, highest quality, delivered monthly in quantities suitable for a house twice this size." She moved through pages with increasing speed, the pattern revealing itself like a map she'd walked before. Lamp oil, grain for the stables, kitchen supplies, every entry just plausible enough to avoid scrutiny, but collectively impossible unless you're hosting the entire peerage. Or unless someone is selling the surplus and pocketing the difference, Julian finished quietly, while paying vendors half the listed price and threatening the staff into silence. Cora straightened. "I've seen this before. Different scale, same method. You need to inventory your actual supplies against these records. The discrepancy will be substantial." Julian was already moving toward the door. "Mrs. Pemberton," he called into the corridor. "Summon Mr. Garrett to the estate office, immediately." The confrontation lasted 17 minutes. Mr. Garrett, a florid man with the confidence of long tenure, blustered, denied, then crumbled when Julian presented discrepancies between the ledgers and a rapid inventory. Mrs. Pemberton personally verified. The steward was dismissed without reference, his threats exposed as empty now that the Duke knew the truth. The household staff, summoned afterward, stood in the great hall while Julian announced the changes, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Wages would be reviewed. Grievances could be brought directly to Mrs. Pemberton. Theft would be punished, but fear would no longer be a management tool. As they dispersed, Cora caught sight of the young maid from the previous night, the one whose sister needed the apothecary. The girl curtsied to her, eyes bright with relief and something that looked remarkably like hope. Julian found Cora in the library an hour later, staring at a book she wasn't reading. "The theft totals nearly £1,500 over 3 years, he said without preamble. "More than some estates generate in annual rents." "I know how much that is." "How?" He moved closer, his gaze intent. "How did you recognize the pattern? Where did you learn to read accounts like that?" Cora closed the book carefully. "When you're living in boarding houses where the landlord charges for bedding, you never receive, and heat that never arrives, you learn to spot fraud. It's the difference between eating and starving. You've been trained by necessity. I've been trained by survival." She met his eyes. "Which is apparently more useful than 2 weeks of learning which fork to use." Something shifted in Julian's expression, the ice cracking just slightly, to reveal what might have been respect underneath. "I underestimated you," he said quietly. "Most people do. I won't make that mistake again." He paused at the doorway. "Thank you, Cora. You've saved the estate a considerable sum and the staff a great deal of suffering." After he left, Cora sat alone in the library, feeling the Abbey shift around her in some fundamental way. She had value here beyond her title, beyond the shield she provided against Lady Eleanor. She had worth. It was terrifying. The shift in Julian's behavior was subtle but undeniable. He began appearing at breakfast, ostensibly to review estate matters. But Cora noticed how his attention would catch on small things, the way she startled when Mrs. Pemberton entered unexpectedly, how she positioned herself in any room with clear sight lines to the exits, the precise moment each evening when her shoulders would tighten as the dinner hour approached. He was studying her, not as a curiosity, but as something he was trying to understand. "You don't have to attend the tenants' dinner," Julian said one morning, 3 weeks after the affair with Garrett. He didn't look up from his correspondence, but his pen had stopped moving. "Mrs. Pemberton can represent the household." Cora set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Is that what you want?" "I want to know if the prospect of 60 people staring at you for 3 hours is worth the distress it's clearly causing." She had been rubbing her left wrist, she realized, an old habit from the streets, checking the bone that had broken and healed badly after a fall. Her hand stilled. "I agreed to perform the role when necessary." Performing and enduring are different things. He finally looked at her, those pale gray eyes seeing too much. "You've been pacing the corridor outside your apartments every night this week. The maids report you barely touch the trays sent up after dinner. If the prospect of a simple tenant gathering—" "It's not simple," Cora interrupted, then stopped, unsure how to explain. That crowds meant danger, meant being seen, meant the possibility of recognition and exposure. That every public appearance was a performance on unstable ground, where a single misstep could send her tumbling back to the streets. Julian watched her for a long moment. "No," he said quietly. "I don't suppose it is." He didn't press further, but Cora felt the weight of his observation like a physical thing, another layer of the cage closing around her. That afternoon, seeking escape from the pressure of being constantly seen, constantly evaluated, she ventured into the older sections of the Abbey. Mrs. Pemberton had mentioned the north wing was largely unused, closed off after the previous Duke's death, maintained but not inhabited. It seemed a safe place to disappear for an hour. The corridor grew colder as she walked, the walls changing from painted plaster to bare stone. Dust motes danced in thin sunlight from narrow windows. The doors here were older, heavier, some still bearing the iron reinforcements from centuries past. One door, at the corridor's end, stood slightly ajar. Cora knew she should turn back. This was precisely the kind of boundary crossing that had gotten her into trouble before, curiosity leading where caution should prevail. But the door was open, and she had spent 3 years learning that open doors were opportunities that closed quickly. She pushed it wider. The room beyond was smaller than she expected, more study than bedchamber. Furniture stood shrouded in holland covers, but someone had been here recently. The dust was disturbed, the air less stale than the corridor. Weak afternoon light filtered through shuttered windows, casting striped shadows across the wooden floor. On a desk by the window sat a leather case, open. Cora moved closer, her instincts warring with propriety. Inside lay objects arranged with careful precision. A lady's glove, pale blue silk. A folded letter, the paper yellowed with age. A miniature portrait of a young woman with dark hair and laughing eyes that seemed to follow Cora across the room. A child's toy soldier, paint worn from handling. That was my son's. Cora spun. Julian stood in the doorway, utterly still. His expression locked down so tightly, she could see the effort it cost him. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "The door was open. I didn't mean to." His name was Thomas. Julian's voice was carefully flat, each word measured out like coins. He was 6 years old when the fever took him. My wife, Catherine, followed 3 days later. They're buried in the family chapel, side by side, though Catherine would have laughed at the formality. She wanted to be buried in the garden where Thomas played. Cora's throat tightened. Your Grace, I shouldn't be here. No one should be here. He moved into the room with the careful control of a man walking through broken glass. I sealed this wing 8 years ago, after the funerals, after the mourning period, after everyone stopped offering condolences that felt like accusations. Accusations of what? Failing to protect them. Julian stopped beside the desk, his fingers hovering over the miniature portrait without quite touching it. I was in London, managing parliamentary business my father insisted couldn't wait. Catherine wrote that Thomas had a mild fever, nothing concerning. By the time I returned, they were both dying, and all my money, all my title, all my careful planning meant precisely nothing. The rawness in his voice was almost unbearable. Cora recognized it. The sound of a wound that had closed but never healed. Scar tissue stretched too thin over something that still bled. My father told me it was divine judgment, Julian continued, his tone flattening further into that terrible control. That I had prioritized duty over family, and God had balanced the scales. He said it at the funeral, in front of half the peerage. Then he returned to Thorncroft and proceeded to systematically attempt to break me for the remaining 2 years of his life. That's monstrous. That's family. His smile was sharp enough to cut. You understand, I think. Your father looked away while your stepmother destroyed you. Mine looked directly at me and did it himself. Different methods, same result. Cora stared at him. This cold, controlled man who had been carrying this weight for 8 years, who had learned to protect himself the same way she had, by refusing to need anything from anyone. Is that why you chose me? She asked quietly. Because I wouldn't expect. I chose you because Lady Eleanor wanted everything I had left to give, Julian interrupted, and I had nothing left to offer her or anyone else. A business arrangement seemed infinitely safer than the alternative. Which is? Caring. The word dropped between them like a stone down a well. Caring leads to loss. Loss leads to the kind of pain that breaks things that can't be repaired. I learned that lesson thoroughly, Duchess. I don't intend to learn it again. He turned toward the door, the conversation clearly finished. But Cora found herself speaking before she could stop. They wanted me to beg, she said. My stepmother and my father. That day they threw me out. They waited to see if I would break down, cry, plead for mercy. I think she would have enjoyed it tremendously. Julian stopped. I didn't give her the satisfaction, Cora continued, staring at the miniature portrait on the desk, at the laughing woman who had loved the cold man in the doorway. I walked out with my head up and my face dry. And for 3 years, I told myself I had won something by refusing to show them my pain. Had you? No. Her voice was barely a whisper. I just learned to carry it where no one could see. Like you do. The silence stretched between them, heavy with shared understanding. Two people who had learned that showing vulnerability meant giving others weapons to destroy you. Two people who had armored themselves so thoroughly, they barely remembered what it felt like to be unguarded. I come here once a month, Julian said finally, not looking at her. On the anniversary of Thomas's birth. I tell myself it's remembrance, but truthfully, I'm not certain anymore what I'm trying to hold on to. The person you were before the loss, Cora said. The version of yourself who could still feel things without fearing they'd destroy you. Julian's hand tightened on the doorframe. For a moment she thought he might respond, might crack open that armor just slightly further. Instead, He straightened, his expression closing. "The tenants' dinner is Friday," he said, his voice returning to that careful neutrality. "If you prefer not to attend, I'll make appropriate excuses." "I'll be there." He nodded once and left, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Cora remained in the dusty room, surrounded by ghosts and mementos of a life Julian had loved and lost. The leather case sat open on the desk, its contents precisely arranged, a shrine to everything he had locked away when he locked away his heart. She understood now why he had chosen her, why he needed a marriage that required nothing he couldn't afford to give. And she understood, with a clarity that felt like standing on the edge of a precipice, that she was beginning to care whether this cold, wounded man ever learned to feel again. It was the most dangerous thing she'd allowed herself to feel in 3 years. The London townhouse was smaller than Thorncroft Abbey, but somehow more oppressive, its elegance concentrated into suffocating proximity. Cora stood before the mirror in her dressing room, while Susan fastened the back of her gown, deep emerald silk that cost more than Cora had seen in her entire 3 years on the streets. "You look every inch a duchess, Your Grace," Susan said, her tone warm with genuine approval. Cora saw someone else entirely. A woman playing dress-up in borrowed finery, about to walk into a room full of people who would recognize the imposter immediately. "The Ashcroft Ball is the event of the season," Julian had explained during the carriage ride to London, his tone carefully neutral. "Our absence would be noted. Our presence will establish you firmly in society and effectively end any remaining speculation about Lady Eleanor's expectations." What he hadn't said, but Cora understood perfectly, this was the performance that mattered. The test that would prove whether his sudden marriage was sustainable or a scandal waiting to collapse. Julian was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, immaculate in black evening clothes that made his pale eyes even more striking. He looked up as she descended, and something flickered across his face. Gone too quickly to name, but present long enough to make her grip the banister tighter. "You'll do admirably," he said quietly, offering his arm. "I'll try not to disgrace you." His fingers closed over hers, where they rested on his sleeve. "Cora, you saved my estate from systematic theft and managed my household with more efficiency in a month than most duchesses achieve in years. You're not the one who should be concerned about adequacy." The carriage ride to Ashcroft House was mercifully short. Cora spent it breathing carefully, trying to remember Mrs. Aldrich's endless tutorials on appropriate conversation and Mrs. Pemberton's instructions on navigating ballrooms. But as they joined the receiving line, all the lessons evaporated like morning fog, leaving only the raw truth. She didn't belong here. The ballroom glittered with the same oppressive elegance she remembered from the night Julian had claimed her. But this time, she wasn't a beggar crashing the gates. She was the Duchess of Thorncroft, and every eye turned to catalogue her deficiencies. "Your Grace." Lady Ashcroft's greeting was perfectly correct and entirely cold. "How lovely that you could join us. We had heard you were indisposed at Thorncroft." "Merely establishing the household," Cora replied, grateful her voice remained steady. "His Grace's estate requires considerable attention." "I'm sure it does." The tone suggested precisely what kind of attention Lady Ashcroft imagined. They moved into the ballroom proper, and Cora felt the weight of observation like physical pressure. Whispers followed in their wake, barely concealed behind fans and gloved hands. Julian's hand remained steady at her elbow, his expression carved from ice, revealing nothing. "Thorncroft, how domestic you've become." The voice cut through the ambient noise with surgical precision. Cora turned to find a woman approaching, tall, elegant, with dark hair arranged in elaborate curls and eyes that assessed everything. and forgave nothing. She moved through the crowd as though it existed solely to part for her convenience. Lady Eleanor Ashcroft. Lady Eleanor. Julian's tone could have frozen water. May I present my wife, Cora, Duchess of Thorncroft? Yes, the mysterious bride who appeared so suddenly. Eleanor's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. You must forgive our curiosity, Your Grace. It's not every day a duke marries so precipitously, and with so little fanfare. One might almost think there was something to hide. Cora felt Julian tense beside her, a subtle shift in his stance that spoke of carefully controlled anger. But before he could respond, Eleanor continued, her attention now fully fixed on Cora with predatory focus. I confess, I've been attempting to place your family. Hartley, was it? I don't recall any Hartleys of significance. Perhaps a minor branch? Or possibly... The pause was delicate, devastating. Trade? The word dropped like a stone into still water, sending ripples of renewed whispers through the nearby crowd. In this glittering assembly, trade was only marginally more acceptable than criminal enterprise. My father was a gentleman, Cora said carefully, aware of how many people were now listening. Though I doubt lineage is particularly relevant to household management. Oh, but it is, Eleanor's voice carried, ensuring maximum audience. Breeding determines so much, don't you think? The proper way to manage servants, to navigate society, to understand one's position. These things are learned from childhood, instilled through generations. They cannot simply be acquired through sudden elevation. The implication was clear. Cora was playing at a role she would never truly inhabit. Then it's fortunate, Julian said, his voice cutting through the mounting tension with absolute authority, that my wife possesses qualities that prove far more valuable than generations of drawing room practice. Intelligence, resourcefulness, the ability to identify and resolve problems that decades of proper breeding somehow failed to notice. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. How charmingly practical. Though I wonder if practicality truly compensates for the absence of proper training. Tell me, Your Grace, she addressed Cora with poisonous sweetness. How are you finding the management of Thorncroft? I imagine it must be rather overwhelming for someone unaccustomed to establishments of such magnitude. It was a trap, and Cora recognized it immediately. Any complaint would confirm her inadequacy. Any praise would sound like ignorant boasting. I find it challenging, she said carefully, in the way any worthwhile endeavor is challenging. The estate is extensive, the staff exceptional, and the standards appropriately exacting. I'm learning daily. From His Grace's servants, I presume? Eleanor's smile turned razor sharp. How charming that the Duchess of Thorncroft requires instruction from the housekeeper. I do hope Mrs. Pemberton is patient. Teaching the fundamentals to someone so unprepared must strain even her considerable professionalism. The words were calculated to humiliate, to reduce Cora to exactly what Eleanor wanted her to be, a mistake, an embarrassment. A woman so far beneath the position that her presence became an insult to the institution itself. Cora felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the urge to flee or fight, to retreat into the defensive armor that had kept her alive on the streets. But before she could respond, Julian moved. It was subtle, a half-step that placed him fractionally between Cora and Eleanor, a shift in his shoulders that somehow made him seem larger, more imposing. His hand found Cora's at the small of her back. A touch so light it might have been accidental, but carried the weight of absolute support. I find your concern for my household management touching, Lady Eleanor, he said. his voice carrying that particular ice that Cora had learned meant he was truly angry. "Though I confess, I'm uncertain why you believe you possess insight into Thorncroft's internal operations. You've never been invited to observe them." Eleanor's composure cracked, just slightly. "I merely meant, you meant to suggest my wife is inadequate to her position. Allow me to clarify. The Duchess of Thorncroft recently identified and resolved a systematic fraud that had operated undetected for 3 years. She reorganized household operations to improve both efficiency and staff welfare. And she accomplished this while learning protocols that, as you so astutely observed, were not instilled from childhood." His pale eyes locked on Eleanor with devastating precision. "I would be fascinated to learn which of your drawing room accomplishments you believe compares favorably." The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor's face had gone white, then red, her hands clenching at her sides. Around them, the crowd had grown, drawn by the scent of conflict between the Duke of Thorncroft and the woman everyone had assumed he would marry. "You've made your choice clear," Eleanor said finally, her voice tight with controlled fury. "I hope you don't come to regret it when the novelty of your practical bride fades and you're left with a duchess who will never truly belong in the position you've thrust her into." She turned and swept away, her departure marked by a wake of renewed whispers. Julian's hand remained steady at Cora's back. "Breathe," he said quietly. She realized she'd been holding her breath, her entire body locked in defensive tension. That was vicious, calculated, and entirely predictable. He guided her toward the terrace doors, away from the staring crowd. "Eleanor plays to win, and she views you as the obstacle that cost her Thorncroft." They stepped into the cool night air, the sounds of the ballroom muffled behind glass doors. Cora's hands were shaking, she realized. Not from fear, but from the aftershock of adrenaline, the fight-or-flight response that had kept her alive and now left her trembling in silk and emeralds. "I should have defended myself better," she said. "You defended yourself admirably." Julian turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders. "You stood your ground without resorting to her tactics. That requires considerably more strength than anything Eleanor demonstrated." She was right, though. "I don't belong. Stop." The command was soft but absolute. "You belong where I say you belong. And I say you belong at Thorncroft as my duchess, regardless of what Eleanor or anyone else believes." Cora looked up at him, at this man who had married her for strategy and convenience, who had kept her at careful distance for weeks, but his eyes held something new now, not warmth perhaps, but a fierce protectiveness that felt almost like it. "Why did you defend me?" she asked quietly. Julian's hands tightened fractionally on her shoulders. "Because you're mine to defend." The possessiveness in his tone should have alarmed her. Instead, it felt like something cracking open inside her chest, letting in light she'd forgotten existed. "The arrangement," she began. "Damn the arrangement." His voice was rough. "You're my wife. That means something, whether we intended it to or not." "My lovely family at this point. Can we just talk about what Julian did at that ball?" He didn't just offend Cora. He chose her over everything. His reputation, Lady Eleanor's political power, societal expectations, all of it. He burned it down because Cora mattered more. Now here's my question. When was the last time a story made you feel something that real? If this moment got to you, if you're sitting there thinking, yes, this is what love should look like, then do me a favor. Hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to remember that they're worth defending. Because stories like this, they only reach people when you help spread them. Don't let this be another video you watch and forget. Like it. Share it. Prove that authentic love stories still matter in a world full of shallow romance. They returned to Thorncroft 3 days after the Ashcroft ball. The London season behind them, like a gauntlet successfully navigated. Julian retreated immediately into estate business. But something had shifted between them. A careful distance replaced by something more complex. He sought her opinion on household matters now. Appeared at dinner with questions about the staff, lingered in doorways as though testing whether conversation might extend beyond necessity. Cora told herself it meant nothing. That protection and partnership were not the same as caring. That the fierce possessiveness in his voice on the terrace had been about pride, not emotion. She almost believed it. The new tenants arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, their carriage rattling up the drive toward Ivy Cottage, the largest of Thorncroft's rental properties. Cora was walking the gardens with Mrs. Pemberton, reviewing plans for the autumn planting, when she caught sight of the arrivals. She stopped mid-sentence, the blood draining from her face. "Your Grace?" Mrs. Pemberton's voice came from a great distance. "Are you unwell?" The woman descending from the carriage was younger than Cora's stepmother, but carried herself with the same calculated elegance. Mrs. Beatrice Whitmore, her stepmother's cousin, who had visited often in the months before Cora's exile, who had sat in the drawing room sipping tea while her stepmother planned Cora's destruction, offering suggestions with the casual cruelty of someone arranging flowers. "I need to return to the house," Cora managed, her voice barely steady. She walked, not ran, though everything in her screamed to flee, back across the lawn. Behind her she heard Mrs. Pemberton's concerned questions, but the words dissolved into noise. All she could see was Beatrice Whitmore's face, the way she would recognize Cora instantly, the way information would flow like water back to London, to her stepmother. To the past Cora had desperately tried to seal away. Julian found her in the library an hour later, standing at the window that overlooked Ivy Cottage in the distance. She hadn't moved. Couldn't seem to make her limbs cooperate beyond the basic act of remaining upright. "Mrs. Pemberton said you seemed distressed." He closed the door behind him, his footsteps quiet on the carpet. "The new tenants?" "I know her." The words felt like they were being dragged from somewhere deep and wounded. "Mrs. Whitmore. She's my stepmother's cousin. She was there, in the house, before." Julian was silent for a moment. "You believe she'll recognize you?" "I know she will." Cora's hands clenched on the windowsill. "And she'll write to my stepmother immediately." She always did. They corresponded weekly, sharing gossip like currency. "Within a week, my stepmother will know exactly where I am and who I've become." "Would that be so terrible?" Julian's voice was carefully neutral. "You're the Duchess of Thorncroft now. Your stepmother can't touch you." "You don't understand." Cora turned to face him, and whatever he saw in her expression made him go very still. "She's not finished with me. She threw me out because I was inconvenient. But now I'm valuable again. She'll want to use that. To extract money, position, favors, whatever she can leverage from the connection. And if I refuse, she'll threaten exposure." Julian finished quietly. "She'll destroy me in front of everyone you need to respect me. She'll make sure all of society knows the Duchess of Thorncroft was a beggar she threw onto the streets like rubbish. She'll paint me as a scheming opportunist who trapped you into marriage, and herself as the wrong stepmother, forced to make difficult decisions about an ungrateful, immoral daughter." The panic was rising now, constricting her chest. 3 years of survival, 6 weeks of careful performance, the fragile security she'd built, all of it threatened by the arrival of one woman who had witnessed her degradation and would relish recounting it. Julian crossed to her, his movements deliberate. "Breathe, Cora. You're safe here." "No." The word came out harsh, desperate. Safe is temporary. Safe is conditional. I learned that when my own father looked away, while his wife destroyed me. Nothing is permanent except the damage people can do when they have power over you. His hands closed over her shoulders, the touch firm enough to ground her. Then we ensure they have no power. We craft a narrative that protects you before they can create one that doesn't. How? I don't know yet. His honesty was somehow more reassuring than false promises. But we'll determine it together. You're not facing this alone. The library door opened. Mrs. Pemberton entered, hesitated when she saw them, then pressed forward with the determination of a woman who had served the family too long to be deterred by awkwardness. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion. We've been clearing the late Duchess's chambers for proper storage, as you requested. We found this among the items." She extended a small wooden box, aged and worn. It was locked in the bottom of her wardrobe, beneath old linens. The key was inside the lock. Julian took the box, frowning. "I don't recognize it." "The style suggests it's quite old, Your Grace. Perhaps a family piece the late Duchess was preserving." But Cora had gone utterly still, staring at the box as though it were a serpent. The wood was walnut, darkened with age, and on the lid, barely visible now, were carved initials. C.H. "May I?" Cora's voice was barely a whisper. Julian handed her the box without question. Cora's fingers trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in faded silk, lay a locket on a delicate gold chain. The metal was tarnished, but unmistakable. A piece of quality far beyond anything her father could have afforded. Cora's breath caught as she opened it. 2 miniature portraits stared back at her. On the left, a young woman with Cora's eyes and her mother's gentle smile. On the right, a man Cora didn't recognize, aristocratic features, kind eyes, wearing clothes that spoke of wealth and position. Beneath the portraits, engraved in script so small, she had to squint to read it. Catherine Hartwell and James Ashford, 1795. "Hartwell," Cora whispered. "Not Hartley. My mother's name was Catherine Hartwell." Her hands shook as she lifted the locket from the box. Beneath it lay papers, a marriage certificate, yellowed with age, a birth record, letters tied with ribbon, the ink faded but legible. Julian was reading over her shoulder now, his body tense. "This certificate. Your mother married James Ashford, Earl of Hartwell's second son. That would make you legitimate." The word came out choked. "My mother was married to a gentleman of actual standing, and this," she held up the birth record, "says I was born 6 months after the wedding. Not before, not illegitimate." "My God," Mrs. Pemberton breathed. "Your stepmother told everyone. She lied." Cora's voice was gaining strength now, fury burning through the panic. "My mother died when I was 10. My father remarried within the year. His new wife claimed my mother had been a governess, that I was born out of wedlock, that my father had married her out of obligation and regretted it always. She used that story to justify treating me as lesser, as expendable." Julian took one of the letters, scanning it rapidly. "These are from your mother's family, the Hartwells, dated before your birth, discussing the wedding, congratulating her on her marriage." He looked up, his eyes sharp. Why would your father allow this deception? He knew the truth. Because my stepmother brought money. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. My father's debts. They were real. My mother's family had cut her off when she married him against their wishes. But his second wife had a fortune from her first husband. He needed that money more than he needed to defend my legitimacy. So he let her rewrite your history. Julian's voice had gone cold with controlled anger. Let her paint you as shameful, disposable, all to preserve his second marriage and his access to her fortune. Cora sank into the nearest chair, the locket clutched in her hand. I have a family, a real family. The Hartwells. They're established, aren't they? The Earl of Hartwell holds considerable land in Derbyshire, Mrs. Pemberton said quietly. Old title, impeccable reputation. If they knew you existed. They don't. Cora looked at the letters, at the evidence of a loving family her mother had left behind. My stepmother made sure of that. She isolated me, kept me from anyone who might have recognized the resemblance or questioned her story. And when I became inconvenient, she threw me away, knowing no one would defend a bastard daughter of no consequence. Except you're not. Julian's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. You're Catherine Hartwell's legitimate daughter. You have standing lineage, a family who might very well welcome the granddaughter they never knew existed. Cora looked up at him. This man who had married her, thinking she was exactly what her stepmother had painted her, a nobody with nothing. Does this change things between us? His expression shifted, something complex and unreadable crossing his features. Should it? You married a beggar to avoid Lady Eleanor. Now you've discovered you actually married an earl's granddaughter. That's rather different. What changes, Julian said carefully, is that you now have weapons to fight back. Your stepmother built her power on lies about your legitimacy. This evidence destroys that foundation entirely. If she attempts to threaten or expose you, we can counter with the truth that she conspired to defraud you of your rightful position and inheritance. Hope flickered in Cora's chest, dangerous and terrifying. You think the Hartwells would acknowledge me? I think your grandfather is 80 years old and has no male heirs. His sons died without legitimate children. You may well be the last of his bloodline. Julian's mouth curved slightly. I think he would be remarkably interested to learn he has a granddaughter, particularly one who is now the Duchess of Thorncroft. Mrs. Pemberton was smiling now, her professional reserve cracking. Oh, Your Grace, this is extraordinary. To think you've been here all this time with family who never knew. We'll need to verify everything, Julian interrupted, already thinking strategically. Contact the Hartwells discreetly, present the evidence, establish the connection before your stepmother learns what we've discovered. And Mrs. Whitmore? Cora's voice was steadier now, anger replacing fear. Let her write to your stepmother. Let them believe they hold all the advantages. Julian's smile turned sharp. They'll discover otherwise soon enough. The letter arrived 6 days later, delivered by a private courier who waited with barely concealed impatience for a response. Julian opened it at breakfast, his expression darkening as he read. They're coming here, he said flatly. Your father and stepmother. They'll arrive this afternoon and expect to be received as family. Cora's teacup clattered against the saucer. No. Julian, you can't let them. I have no intention of turning them away. His voice was ice over steel. Let them come. We'll be ready. But Cora wasn't ready. As the hours crawled toward afternoon, she felt the old terror rising like floodwater, drowning the fragile confidence she'd built over the past weeks. She found herself checking exits, measuring distances, her body remembering what her mind tried to forget. That these people had the power to destroy her, with a few well-chosen words. Julian found her in the music room, standing at the window that overlooked the drive, her hands clenched so tightly her nails drew blood from her palms. "They can't hurt you here," he said quietly. "You don't know what they're capable of." Her voice was hollow. "My stepmother doesn't make threats she can't execute. If she's coming here, she's already decided exactly how to use me. How to extract maximum value before she discards me again." "Then she's miscalculated." Julian moved to stand beside her. "She's accustomed to dealing with your father, weak, desperate, willing to trade anything for peace. She's not accustomed to dealing with me." The carriage appeared in the distance, moving up the long drive with leisurely confidence. Cora's breath shortened, her vision narrowing to that single point of approaching threat. "Cora." Julian's hand closed over hers, warm and solid. "Look at me." She forced her gaze away from the window. His pale eyes held hers with absolute focus. "You survived 3 years alone with nothing," he said. "You rebuilt yourself from ruins. You are not the frightened girl they threw away. You are the Duchess of Thorncroft. And you will face them from a position of strength, not supplication. Do you understand?" She wanted to believe him. But the carriage was closer now, and with it came the memories, her father's averted gaze, her stepmother's cold satisfaction, the moment she had realized no one was going to save her. The butler appeared in the doorway. "Your Grace, Mr. and Mrs. Nathaniel Hartley request an audience." Julian's expression could have frozen flame. "Show them to the drawing room. We'll attend them shortly." "Shall I serve refreshments, Your Grace?" "No." The single word carried absolute finality. "This won't be a social call." They waited 5 minutes, a calculated delay that established exactly who held power here. Cora used the time to armor herself, to push the terror down into the box where she'd kept it locked for 3 years. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and reminded herself that she wore silk now, not rags. That she was a duchess, not a beggar. That she was not alone. Julian offered his arm. "Ready?" "No." Cora placed her hand on his sleeve. "But I'll go anyway." The drawing room was one of Thorncroft's finest chambers, decorated in shades of cream and gold that spoke of wealth so old it required no announcement. Against this backdrop, Cora's father and stepmother looked exactly what they were, minor gentry desperately clinging to the appearance of status. Nathaniel Hartley had aged poorly in 3 years. His face carried the broken veins of a heavy drinker, his evening coat strained across his expanding waistline. But it was her stepmother who dominated the space, standing before the fireplace as though she owned it, wearing a gown of purple silk that was too young for her, too fine for the occasion, and unmistakably expensive. Cora's mother's locket, hidden beneath her own gown, felt heavy against her skin. "Cora," her stepmother's smile was warm, maternal, utterly false. "How wonderful you look, darling. Duchess suits you remarkably well." The endearment was a violation. Cora's hands tightened on Julian's arm. "Mr. Hartley, Mrs. Hartley." Julian's voice could have cut glass. "You requested this meeting. State your business." Nathaniel shifted uncomfortably. "Your Grace, surely we can be civil. We are family after all." "We are nothing of the sort," Julian interrupted. "You are the man who cast his daughter onto the streets and the woman who orchestrated it. You are permitted in my house solely because I wish to understand what you hope to gain from this intrusion. Speak plainly or leave." Cora's stepmother's smile tightened, but her composure held. "How direct you are, Your Grace. Very well. We've come because we believe there has been a misunderstanding. A regrettable situation that, with proper discussion, can be resolved to everyone's satisfaction." What situation would that be? Julian's tone suggested he knew exactly what was coming. The circumstances of Cora's departure from our household 3 years ago. Her stepmother moved closer, her voice dropping to something like concern. "I'm afraid rumors have begun circulating, dreadful gossip suggesting we treated her poorly, that we abandoned her. Nothing could be further from the truth." "Really?" Julian's expression didn't change. "Then perhaps you'll explain what actually occurred." "A misunderstanding between parent and child." Nathaniel found his voice, though he still wouldn't look at Cora. "A disagreement that escalated unfortunately. We attempted to locate her, to reconcile, but she had disappeared entirely. We've been searching ever since." The lie was so brazen Cora felt bile rise in her throat. "How devoted," Julian said with devastating mildness. "Though I confess, I'm uncertain why you felt compelled to inform me of your search. Surely that's a family matter." "It becomes relevant," her stepmother said, "when one considers how such rumors might damage the Duchess's reputation. And by extension, yours. Society can be cruel, Your Grace. Questions about Cora's missing years, speculation about where she was, how she survived." The threat hung delicately in the air. It would be unfortunate if such gossip gained traction. "Are you threatening to spread rumors about my wife?" Julian's voice had gone very quiet. "Merely observing that rumors, once started, are difficult to contain." Her stepmother's smile sharpened. "Unless, of course, the family presents a united front. If we were to publicly reconcile, to explain that Cora was visiting distant relations during those years, studying abroad perhaps, such a narrative would quiet speculation entirely. And this reconciliation would require what, exactly?" "A modest settlement. £20,000 would allow us to establish ourselves comfortably, to move in circles where our presence supports, rather than questions, Cora's position. Consider it an investment in your wife's reputation." The amount was staggering, more than many estates generated in years. Cora felt the room tilt slightly. This was it. The moment Julian would realize she cost more than she was worth. That protecting her meant pouring fortune into a bottomless well of extortion. But Julian laughed. The sound was cold, utterly devoid of humor, and it stopped her stepmother mid-breath. "Let me clarify our positions," he said, moving to stand directly between Cora and her stepmother. "You believe you can extract payment by threatening to reveal that my wife spent 3 years in reduced circumstances. You believe society will care more about those missing years than about the fact that you deliberately cast out your stepdaughter and are now attempting blackmail." "That's not," Nathaniel began. "Be silent." Julian's command cracked like a whip. "You had your opportunity to speak. Now you'll listen. You will not receive £1 from me or my estates. You will not spread rumors, because if you do, I will personally ensure that every drawing room in London knows you threw a 19-year-old girl onto the streets and are now attempting to profit from her position." Her stepmother's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand what we can do. No, you don't understand what I can do." Julian's voice dropped to something dangerous. "I am the Duke of Thorncroft. I hold influence you cannot begin to comprehend. If you threaten my wife again, I will destroy you so thoroughly that no amount of expensive purple silk will restore your standing. You will be cut from every guest list, barred from every respectable house, reduced to the nothing you tried to reduce her to. She was a burden. Her stepmother's control shattered entirely. An ungrateful, sullen burden who served no purpose. We gave her a home for years. You gave her nothing but cruelty. Cora's voice surprised even herself, steady and cold. You lied about my mother, erased my legitimacy, and threw me away when I became inconvenient. You made one critical mistake. What mistake? Her father's voice was barely a whisper. You assumed I would stay broken. Cora stepped forward, Julian's presence solid at her back. That I would remain the frightened girl you discarded. But I survived. I rebuilt myself. And now, I have something you never anticipated. Proof of exactly what you stole from me. She drew the locket from beneath her gown, letting it catch the light. Her stepmother went white. That's mine, she whispered. I destroyed all of... You destroyed what you could find. Cora's smile was sharp. But not everything. I have my mother's marriage certificate, her letters from the Hartwell family, documentation of my legitimate birth. Everything you tried to erase to justify treating me as less than nothing. The Hartwells? Nathaniel's voice cracked. Cora, you can't. They'll ask questions. Let them ask. Julian's hand found Cora's shoulder. The Earl will be fascinated to learn he has a granddaughter, and even more fascinated to learn how his daughter's widower and his second wife conspired to defraud that granddaughter of her rightful position. The silence that followed was absolute. Her stepmother's face had gone from white to gray, her hands trembling. Nathaniel had collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands. Get out, Julian said quietly. Leave Thorncroft and never return. If I hear you've spoken my wife's name in public, if you've attempted to contact her or spread rumors, I will make good on every threat I've outlined. Am I understood? They left without another word, her stepmother's purple silk rustling furiously as she swept from the room, her father following like a whipped dog. Through the window, Cora watched their carriage retreat down the drive, carrying away the people who had haunted her nightmares for 3 years. Her legs gave out. Julian caught her before she hit the floor, lowering them both to the sofa. Cora was shaking violently, the armor she'd maintained cracking apart now that the immediate threat had passed. You sent them away, she whispered against his shoulder. You chose me over the money, over avoiding scandal. There was no choice to make. His arms tightened around her. Did you truly believe I would pay them? That I would let them hurt you again? I believed you would be practical. That £20,000 and social peace would outweigh you. His hand came up to cup her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. Would outweigh you. Cora, I married you to avoid Lady Eleanor, yes. But I'll be damned before I let anyone treat you as disposable. Not your stepmother, not society, not even yourself. The tears came then, 3 years of them, pouring out in great racking sobs she couldn't control. Julian held her through it, his presence steady and unmovable, until the storm passed and left her hollowed out and oddly clean. Thank you, she whispered finally. Don't thank me for basic decency. His voice was rough. Thank me when I've tracked down your grandfather and ensured you never have to fear those people again. The autumn dinner at Thorncroft Abbey was meant to be a statement, a formal presentation of the new Duchess to the neighboring gentry and select members of London society. 60 guests. Mrs. Pemberton had informed Cora with barely concealed pride. The most significant gathering the Abbey had hosted in 8 years. Cora stood in her dressing room, watching Susan fasten the final buttons on a gown of deep sapphire silk that made her eyes look almost luminous. She looked every inch a duchess now. The gauntness of the streets replaced by healthy curves, her skin no longer sallow, her hair arranged in elaborate curls that had taken Susan an hour to perfect. But beneath the silken jewels, her heart hammered with familiar dread. "You look magnificent, Your Grace," Susan said warmly. "His Grace won't be able to take his eyes off you." Cora managed to smile, though her hands trembled as she fastened her mother's locket, now polished to gleaming, around her neck. Julian had sent word to the Earl of Hartwell 3 weeks ago. They were still waiting for a response. But the knowledge that her grandfather knew of her existence felt like armor of its own kind. The dinner guests had already arrived, their voices carrying up from the drawing room in a gentle roar of polite conversation. Through her window, Cora could see carriages still arriving, the drive lit by torches that turned the autumn evening golden. One more carriage, larger than the others, moving faster. Cora's blood went cold. She knew that carriage, had watched it pull away from her father's house 3 years ago, carrying away her last hope of intervention from family friends who had chosen to believe her stepmother's lies rather than help. "No," she whispered. "They wouldn't dare." But even as she thought it, she knew better. Her stepmother had been humiliated at Thorncroft, her extortion scheme demolished, her lies exposed. A woman like that didn't retreat quietly. She retaliated. Cora ran. She took the servants' stairs, her silk skirts gathered in shaking hands, racing toward the drawing room where Julian was receiving guests. She had to warn him, had to prepare him for whatever attack her stepmother was planning. The crash of the main doors, slamming open, echoed through the Abbey like a gunshot. Cora reached the drawing room entrance in time to see her father and stepmother sweep into the hall. Still in traveling clothes, her stepmother's face flushed with fury and triumph. Behind them came Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, and 2 other couples Cora recognized from her childhood, all family friends who had abandoned her when she needed them most. "Where is she?" Her stepmother's voice rang through the suddenly silent hall. "Where is the little fraud who has deceived the Duke of Thorncroft?" Julian appeared in the drawing room doorway, his expression carved from ice. "Mrs. Hartley, you were instructed never to return to Thorncroft." "I'm not here for you, Your Grace." Her stepmother's smile was vicious. "I'm here to save you from a terrible deception, to reveal the truth about the woman you've been harboring as your duchess." The drawing room had gone utterly silent. 60 guests, the cream of local society and select London aristocracy, pressed forward to witness the spectacle. Cora saw Lady Ashcroft among them, her expression avid with malicious curiosity. Saw neighbors she'd met in the past weeks, county families who had accepted her cautiously, but seemed willing to give the new duchess a chance. All of them watching as her stepmother prepared to destroy her. "The truth," her stepmother announced, her voice carrying to every corner, "is that this woman, this creature you've elevated to be your duchess, is nothing but a beggar we threw off our doorstep 3 years ago. A lying, manipulative girl who has somehow convinced you she's worthy of your name and position." Murmurs erupted. Shocked whispers, the sound of reputation crumbling in real time. "She was found in the streets," her father added, his voice slurred with drink and desperation. "Crashing balls she had no right to attend, stealing clothes, living God knows where, doing God knows what to survive. We tried to help her, tried to give her a home, but she was ungrateful, immoral." A stain on our family, her stepmother finished. And now, a stain on yours, Your Grace. We've come to offer you a way out. Annul this farce of a marriage. We'll take her back, keep her quiet, and save you from the scandal. Enough! Julian's voice cut through the rising chaos like a blade. He descended the stairs with deliberate precision, his pale eyes locked on Cora's stepmother with an intensity that made even her falter. You will be silent, he said quietly, or I will have you forcibly removed. You can't silence the truth. Her stepmother's voice rose to a shrill pitch. Everyone needs to know what she is. A beggar, a nothing. A girl we threw away because she was worthless. I know exactly what she is. Cora's breath stopped. Julian had reached the bottom of the stairs, and now he turned, his gaze finding hers where she stood frozen in the doorway. The entire assembly turned to look at her, 60 pairs of eyes cataloging her shock, her fear, her shame laid bare for their examination. She wanted to run. Every instinct screamed to flee before the final blow landed, before Julian confirmed what her stepmother had announced, before she watched him choose his reputation over the wife, who had brought him nothing but scandal. Instead, Julian crossed to her. He took her hand in front of everyone, in full view of the assembled gentry and her triumphant stepmother, and drew her forward into the center of the hall. You're right, he said, his voice carrying to every corner. My wife was found in the streets. She had been cast out by her family, abandoned by people who should have protected her, left to survive alone at 19 years old. Cora's throat closed. He was confirming it, making it real, destroying whatever fragile standing she'd built. And she survived, Julian continued, his grip on her hand tightening. For 3 years, she survived poverty, hunger, and desperation that would have broken stronger people. She developed resourcefulness that identified fraud my own steward had hidden for years. She possessed courage enough to crash a Duke's ball when she had nothing left to lose. And she had the intelligence to recognize that a marriage of convenience might save us both from circumstances we couldn't face alone. The room was utterly silent now. Her stepmother's triumphant expression had begun to waver. I married Cora knowing she came from nothing, Julian said, his pale eyes holding the assembly with absolute authority. What I didn't know, what I discovered only recently, is that she comes from considerably more than that. My wife is the legitimate granddaughter of the Earl of Hartwell, though her father and stepmother conspired to hide that fact. They stole her inheritance, erased her legitimacy, and cast her out when she became inconvenient to their financial schemes. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Her stepmother had gone white. But even if she weren't the Earl's granddaughter, Julian continued, his voice dropping to something fierce and absolute, even if she had no title, no family, no heritage beyond the streets, she would still be my Duchess. Because I didn't marry her for her bloodline. I married her because she possesses qualities that prove far more valuable than any lineage. He turned to face Cora fully, his hands coming up to frame her face, and in his eyes she saw something that stole her breath. Not calculation, not strategy, but raw, unguarded emotion. I married you because you're brave enough to survive what should have destroyed you, he said, his voice meant for her alone but carrying in the silence. Because you're strong enough to rebuild from ruins. Because you see through the armor I've spent 8 years perfecting. And you've never once asked me to be less than honest about the wreckage underneath. Julian, her voice broke. I married you for convenience, he continued, and I'm keeping you for love. Because somewhere between your arrival and this moment, you stopped being a shield and became the only person I want standing beside me. And if that scandalizes society, if it costs me political alliances or social standing, then so be it. I've already lost everything that mattered once. I won't lose you too. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war against every convention, every expectation, every rule that governed their world. Cora stared at him, this cold, controlled man who had just burned every bridge for her, who had chosen her over reputation and standing and everything a duke was supposed to value. "You love me," she whispered. "Apparently." His mouth curved slightly. Inconvenient, but undeniable. Behind them, her stepmother found her voice. "This is madness. Your Grace, you can't possibly. She's nothing. She's my wife," Julian said without turning. "And you're trespassing. I believe I made clear what would happen if you threatened her again." He raised his hand, and footmen appeared from the shadows. "Escort Mr. and Mrs. Hartley from the property. If they resist, summon the magistrate. They're not to return under any circumstances." "You can't do this." Her stepmother's composure shattered entirely. "We're her family. You were never her family." Julian's voice could have frozen flame. "Family doesn't discard people when they become inconvenient. You taught me that lesson 8 years ago when my own father tried to break me. I learned it well. Now leave my house before I have you removed by force." They went, her stepmother still shrieking protests, her father stumbling drunk and defeated. The witnesses they'd brought, the Whitmores and the other couples, melted away into the night. Their role in the attempted humiliation, now a liability rather than an alliance. The drawing room remained silent. 60 guests watched, waiting to see how this unprecedented scene would resolve. Julian turned to face them, Cora's hand still clasped in his. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with perfect, devastating calm, "I apologize for the disruption to our evening. The menu remains excellent, and I believe Mrs. Pemberton has outdone herself with the arrangements. Shall we proceed to dinner?" It was Lady Ashcroft, surprisingly, who moved first. She stepped forward, executed a perfect curtsy to Cora, and said clearly, "Your Grace, that locket is exquisite. Is it a family piece?" Cora's hand rose to touch the golden surface, still warm against her skin. "It was my mother's. Catherine Hartwell." "The Earl's daughter?" Lady Ashcroft's eyebrows rose. "I had the pleasure of meeting her once, many years ago. You have her eyes, and apparently her courage." It was acceptance, grudging perhaps, but real. And as Lady Ashcroft moved toward the dining room, the other guests began to follow, the social machinery grinding back into motion, because a duchess and a duke had declared it so. The dinner proceeded with surreal normalcy. Courses appeared and disappeared. Conversation flowed around topics carefully distant from the scene they'd witnessed. But Cora felt the shift in how people addressed her, no longer with cautious tolerance, but with the respect due to someone the Duke of Thorncroft had publicly claimed as his equal. Julian sat beside her throughout, his hand finding hers beneath the table when no one was looking, his presence solid and unmovable. When the final guests departed near midnight, praising the evening with the careful enthusiasm of people who had witnessed history and weren't quite sure what to make of it, Cora found herself alone with Julian in the drawing room. The servants dismissed. "'Tis, house finally quiet." "You shouldn't have done that," she said. "Which part?" "All of it. The public declaration, the confrontation, Her voice caught. "The love." Julian crossed to her, his expression open in a way she'd never seen. I should have done it weeks ago. I should have acknowledged what was happening the moment I realized I was seeking your company because I wanted it, not because protocol required it. You barely knew me. I knew enough. His hands came up to frame her face, the gesture now familiar, grounding. I knew you survived alone. I knew you saved my estate. I knew you understood loss without needing explanations. And I knew that somewhere between strategy and survival, I'd started caring whether you were happy here. I'm terrified, Cora whispered. Of what? That this is temporary. That you'll realize I'm not worth the scandal, the cost, the stop. His forehead came to rest against hers. I've spent 8 years building armor to protect myself from feeling anything. You dismantled it in 6 weeks. If that's not worth defending, nothing is. Cora's hands rose to his chest, feeling his heart beating steady beneath expensive fabric. I love you too, she said quietly. I think I have since you stood in that drawing room and refused to let my stepmother take anything more from me. Then we're both doomed to inconvenient emotional attachments. Apparently. She smiled despite the tears threatening. What happens now? Now, Julian said, we write to your grandfather. We establish your rightful place in the Hartwell family. We make it absolutely clear to anyone who questions your position that the Duchess of Thorncroft comes from impeccable lineage and has my complete devotion. And if society doesn't accept it? His smile turned sharp. Then society learns that the Duke of Thorncroft doesn't require their approval. I've already survived the worst loss imaginable. I refuse to lose you to other people's judgment. He kissed her then, in the drawing room where hours ago her stepmother had tried to destroy her, and Cora felt the final walls around her heart crack open. She had spent 3 years learning to survive alone. Now she was learning something far more terrifying. How to trust that she didn't have to. The letter from the Earl of Hartwell arrived 3 weeks after the disastrous dinner party, delivered by a liveried courier who waited with ceremonial patience for a response. Cora stood in Julian's study, the heavy parchment trembling in her hands, unable to make herself break the seal. Outside, November rain lashed against the windows, turning the world gray and uncertain. He could be rejecting the connection, she said quietly. 70 years of impeccable reputation. Why would he risk it for a granddaughter he's never met? A granddaughter whose legitimacy depends on documents that might be questioned, whose recent history includes 3 years of Cora. Julian looked up from his correspondence, his pale eyes steady. Open the letter. She broke the seal with shaking fingers. The script inside was spidery but firm, the words clear despite the writer's evident age. My dear granddaughter, I have spent the past fortnight examining the documents His Grace sent, consulting with my solicitors, and reviewing every scrap of correspondence I preserved from your mother's brief marriage. The evidence is irrefutable. You are Catherine's daughter, my legitimate granddaughter, and the last living connection to the child I lost when pride prevented me from accepting her choice of husband. I cast your mother out when she married against my wishes. I told myself it was principle, that a Hartwell didn't marry for love alone, that she would return when poverty taught her the error of her ways. She never did. She died, and I learned of it months later through a brief notice in the papers. I have lived with that failure for 12 years. You survived what she did not. You endured abandonment, poverty, and circumstances that would have destroyed lesser souls. That you did so, and emerged strong enough to save a duke's estate, wise enough to marry for strategy, and brave enough to face down the people who wronged you, speaks to a character I can only admire. I am 81 years old. My sons are dead, my line apparently ending with me. To discover I have a granddaughter, one who carries Catherine's eyes and spirit, is a gift I don't deserve but will gratefully accept if you'll permit it. I would very much like to meet you, at your convenience and only if you wish it. I have no right to demand anything of you, but I would be honored to know the woman my granddaughter has become. Your grandfather, Edmund Hartwell. The letter blurred as tears spilled down Cora's cheeks. Julian was beside her instantly, taking the parchment before she could crumple it, reading rapidly. He wants to meet you, he said, something like wonder in his voice. He's claiming you publicly. He said he doesn't deserve it. Cora's voice broke. He cast out my mother and he thinks I'll reject him the same way. Will you? She looked up at Julian, at this man who had defended her against her own family, who had burned his social standing to ashes rather than let her be humiliated. No. I know what it costs to live with regret. If he's offering connection, I won't refuse it. The Earl of Hartwell arrived at Thorncroft Abbey a week later, traveling despite his age and the deteriorating weather. Cora watched his carriage approach with her heart in her throat. Julian's steady presence beside her, the only thing keeping her grounded. The man who descended was tall despite his years, his frame still carrying hints of the strength it had once possessed. His hair was white, his face deeply lined, but his eyes, pale blue, like her mother's, like hers, were sharp and assessing. He stopped 3 feet from where Cora stood on the steps, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. Catherine's daughter, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. My God, you have her eyes, her chin, even the way you stand, defiant, even when you're terrified. I'm not terrified, Cora lied. His smile was sad and knowing. Your mother said the same thing the day she told me she was marrying your father, regardless of my approval. She was lying too. They stared at each other, two survivors of different battles, connected by blood and loss and the woman who had loved them both. I'm sorry, the Earl said quietly, for failing your mother, for not being there when she needed me, for allowing my pride to cost me 12 years. I could have known her. And 22 years, I could have known you. You didn't know I existed. I should have sought her out, should have swallowed my pride and ensured she was well. His hands tightened on his walking stick. I failed her. I won't fail you. If you'll permit me to know you, to claim you as my granddaughter, I swear I will spend whatever time I have left ensuring you never doubt your worth or your place. Cora felt something break open in her chest. The last wall around the frightened girl who had been thrown away and told she was worthless. I would like that, she whispered. The Earl's composure cracked. He moved forward, and Cora met him halfway, feeling his arms close around her with a strength that belied his age. He smelled of pipe tobacco and old books, and his embrace was nothing like her father's reluctant, duty-bound affection. This was the grip of a man who had lost too much and was determined not to lose anything more. Welcome home, child, he murmured against her hair. Welcome to the family that should have protected you. Julian watched from the steps, his expression carefully neutral. But Cora saw the way his shoulders had relaxed, the tension he'd carried since her stepmother's attack finally easing. That evening, after the Earl had retired to his chambers and the house had settled into quiet, Cora found Julian in the library. He stood at the window overlooking the grounds, rain still streaking the glass his reflection ghostly in the darkness beyond. "You've been avoiding me," she said. "I've been giving you space." He didn't turn. "Your grandfather arrived to claim you, to offer you everything you should have had: family, position, unconditional acceptance. I thought you might need time to decide what that means for you." "What it means for us, you mean?" Now he did turn, his expression guarded. "You married me because you needed protection. You have that now from a source more permanent than a marriage of convenience. Your grandfather is wealthy, influential, devoted to you. You don't need me anymore." Cora crossed to him, her heart aching at the careful way he'd built the walls back up, protecting himself from the possibility of loss. "Is that what you think? That I'll leave now that I have other options? It would be practical." His voice was flat. "Our arrangement was always temporary, a shield for both of us until circumstances changed. Circumstances have changed dramatically." "They have," Cora agreed. "I'm no longer a beggar with nothing. I have family, heritage, security. I could walk away from this marriage and still have a position in society." Julian's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Yes. So when I tell you I'm staying, you'll understand it's not because I need you." She moved closer until she could feel his heat, see the way his eyes had gone dark with emotion he was trying desperately to control. "It's because I choose you. Because somewhere between your cold proposition and your public declaration, I fell completely in love with the man underneath all that armor." "Cora, you told me once that caring leads to loss," she interrupted. "That you learned that lesson and wouldn't learn it again. But you forgot something." "What?" "Not caring leads to a different kind of loss. A slower one. The kind where you wake up one day and realize you've been alive, but not living. Protected, but not whole." Her hands came up to his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her palms. "I spent 3 years surviving. Just surviving. Never trusting, never hoping, never believing I deserved anything more than the next meal and the next safe place to sleep." "You deserved everything," Julian said roughly. "So did you." Cora's voice gentled. "You lost your wife and son. Your father tried to break you. You built walls so high and thick that nothing could hurt you again. But nothing could reach you either. You were protecting yourself into isolation. Until you crashed my carefully controlled life and dismantled everything I thought I needed." His hands came up to frame her face, the gesture achingly familiar. "You terrify me, Cora. The depth of what I feel for you, the way I can't imagine this house, this life, without you in it. It's everything I swore I'd never risk again." "I'm terrified too." She leaned into his touch. "Every instinct I developed tells me this can't last. That people always leave. That security is always temporary. But I'm choosing to trust you anyway. To believe that what we have is worth the risk." "It is." The words came out fierce. "God help me. You're worth every risk, every scandal, every bridge I burned defending you. I love you, Cora. Not because you're convenient. Not because you're the Earl's granddaughter. But because you see me, all of me, including the broken parts. And you stay anyway." "Then promise me something," Cora whispered. "Anything. Promise you'll stop protecting yourself from me. No more walls, no more careful distance. If we're doing this, truly doing this, I need all of you. The cold duke and the grieving father, the strategic mind and the wounded heart. All of it. Julian's forehead came to rest against hers, his breathing unsteady. I don't know if I remember how to be unguarded. Then we'll learn together. She smiled despite the tears threatening. I'm still learning to believe I deserve unconditional acceptance. You're learning to trust that caring doesn't always lead to loss. We'll figure it out as we go. That's a terrible strategy. It's the only one we have. He kissed her then, and it wasn't the controlled, strategic kiss of a man managing an arrangement. It was raw and desperate and full of everything he'd been holding back, fear and hope and love so fierce it felt like coming home after years of wandering. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Julian's armor was gone entirely. His eyes held hers with absolute vulnerability. I vow, he said quietly, to protect you, not because you need protecting, but because I choose to stand beside you, to value you, not for your heritage or your utility, but for exactly who you are. To love you unconditionally, even when, especially when, it terrifies me. Cora's throat tightened. And I vow to trust you, even when every survival instinct tells me not to. To believe in us, even when I'm afraid. To love you with everything I have, including the broken parts. Then we're agreed. His smile was soft, genuine, transforming his severe features into something almost beautiful. This marriage is no longer a convenience. What is it then? Everything. He pulled her closer, his arms solid around her. Everything I didn't know I was missing, until you crashed into my life and refused to settle for anything less than honesty. Outside, the rain had stopped. Through the window, moonlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the grounds in silver light. Thorncroft Abbey stood solid and ancient, its walls holding not just a duke and duchess, but two people who had survived their separate hells and found each other in the aftermath. Cora leaned into Julian's embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the warmth of his presence, the absolute certainty of his acceptance. She had been a beggar on the streets, discarded and forgotten. Now she was a duchess, a granddaughter, a woman who had fought her way from nothing to everything. But more than any title or position, she was loved. Unconditionally, fiercely, permanently. And for the first time in 3 years, Cora stopped looking for the exits and allowed herself to stay. So here we are. Cora went from sleeping in doorways to finding a man who would burn down his entire world rather than let anyone hurt her again. And if you made it this far, you know this wasn't just a romance. It was a story about two broken people learning that being loved doesn't mean being perfect. Now, I'll be honest with you. Creating these deeply emotional, character-driven stories takes hours of writing, editing, and pouring my heart into every word. The only way I can keep making them is if you actually subscribe. Not maybe later subscribe. Right now subscribe. Because YouTube doesn't care how good a story is if people don't engage with it. So if this story moved you, if Cora and Julian's journey meant something, if you want more tales of survival and second chances, and love that's earned, subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment below telling me which moment hit you hardest. Don't just consume and disappear. Be part of the community that keeps these stories alive. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team.